On April 16, 1944, the operational ceiling for the 5th Air Force was defined not by enemy fire but by a wall of water. A massive tropical front formed between the target at Hollandia and the recovery bases at Nadzab and Gusap. This weather system created a geometric trap for the returning bombers. Any detour around the storm pushed fuel consumption beyond safe margins for the returning aircraft. This event is remembered as Black Sunday. It was a day when the weather closed the corridor home, and forecasts and briefings did not convey how completely the front would block the return route, forcing dozens of pilots into a binary choice between bailing out into the canopy or attempting a forced landing on whatever terrain they could find. One of those pilots was USAAF aviator Charles Davidson, then a second lieutenant. He was flying a Douglas A-20G Havoc, serial number 4-2-86786. His aircraft was identified by the letter F painted on the vertical stabilizer and distinctive nose art reading Hell'N Pelican II. As the formation fractured in zero visibility, Davidson found himself separated and running on fumes. The fuel gauges indicated empty. He spotted a patch of kunai grass near the village of Amimon in the Gogol River area, inland from Madang. The decision to land was driven by a procedural priority to keep the crew together. Bailing out in dense jungle often resulted in separation and loss of personnel. Davidson ordered his gunner, Sergeant John McKenna, to brace for impact. He kept the landing gear retracted. A wheels-up landing on soft terrain minimizes the risk of the aircraft flipping over, but it eliminates the primary method of deceleration. Without wheel brakes, the pilot must rely on aerodynamic braking. This is the use of control surfaces and environmental friction to arrest forward momentum. Davidson dropped the flaps to increase drag and lower the stall speed. He held the aircraft off the ground as long as possible to bleed off kinetic energy. When the fuselage finally settled into the 7-foot-tall kunai grass, the vegetation acted as a friction brake. The aluminum skin slid over the grass, transferring the energy of the roughly 26,000-pound aircraft into the earth. The propellers struck the ground as the aircraft slid to a stop. The blades bent backward in a uniform curve. It is a detail consistent with a ground strike during a belly landing, but it cannot, by itself, prove the exact power setting at impact. The aircraft came to rest intact. The solid nose structure of the G variant prevented the cockpit from crushing inward. Both Davidson and McKenna exited the aircraft without major injury. They were missing for days, trekking through the jungle before reaching help, a journey later remembered as lasting about 15 days. For 32 years, the aircraft remained hidden by the rapid growth of the jungle. It was not until surveys in 1976 that aviation historian Michael Claringbold helped reconnect the site to the wartime records. The environment had consumed the aircraft, but it had not destroyed it. The aluminum surfaces were oxidized, but the structural integrity remained high. And the identity was established through surviving serial markings, stencils, and documentation tying the wreck to that same airframe. Traces of the nose art helped link the story to the name Hell'N Pelican II, but the numbers and the records carried the proof. With the records locked in, the site stopped being an anonymous wreck and became a specific historical asset. The A-20G model is distinct from other variants because it features a solid nose housing 650 caliber machine guns instead of a glass bombardier station. This configuration was built for low-level strafing. Finding a solid nose G model in recoverable condition is statistically rare. Most were destroyed by the violence of their low-altitude missions or scrapped after the war. The discovery presented a new problem. The aircraft was 16 miles from the nearest infrastructure but separated by terrain that made ground transport impossible. It sat in a location that no truck could reach. The only way out was vertical. However, the aircraft was no longer just an airframe. It was a container filled with decades of soil and water. The weight of the mud trapped inside the wings and fuselage created a load that threatened to exceed the capacity of any available lift helicopter. The recovery team faced a paradox, and to save the aircraft, they might have to take it apart in the middle of the jungle. For 40 years, the jungle environment acted as a preservation chamber rather than a demolition site. While many aircraft lost in New Guinea were consumed by saltwater corrosion or scrapped by local salvagers, this specific airframe remained suspended in time. The survival of the aluminum structure was determined by the specific mechanics of the crash on April 16, 1944. It wasn't enemy fire or a mechanical fault. It was fuel criticality. This is the operational state where the remaining fuel reserves are insufficient to allow any deviation from the most direct flight path. That afternoon, the front sealed off the direct route home, and any workaround demanded more range than the aircraft had left. Fuel criticality converts a navigation problem into a physics problem. Second Lieutenant Davidson faced this steep descent rate. Second Lieutenant Davidson faced this equation 16 miles short of Madang. The two Wright R2600 engines were rated at 1,600 horsepower each. When they were starved of fuel, they became dead weight on the wings. The loss of thrust forced the pilot to rely entirely on energy management. Energy management in a forced landing is the calculated trade of potential energy for distance. The aircraft has a finite amount of altitude, which represents its potential energy, and a specific airspeed, which represents its kinetic energy. The pilot must spend this energy budget to reach a survivable landing zone. If he spends too much altitude to maintain speed, he hits the ground early. If he bleeds too much speed to extend the glide, he risks a catastrophic stall. Davidson managed this trade perfectly. He aligned the aircraft with a clearing in the kunai grass, maximizing the glide distance without stalling the airframe. The impact dynamics were violent but survivable. The solid nose plowed through the vegetation, acting as a shield for the cockpit. The engines were silent at the moment of impact, which prevented a post-crash fire. That silence mattered. Without fuel and without heat, there was no fire to erase the alloy's strength. The bent propellers locked in their backward curve serve as the forensic evidence of this low-energy state. After the crew walked away, the environment began to claim the machine. The tall kunai grass grew over the fuselage, shielding it from the direct sun and the worst of the salt-laden winds coming off the coast. However, the jungle floor is not static. Over 4 decades, the aircraft slowly settled into the soft earth. Rain washed soil and organic matter into every opening. The interior of the fuselage, which had once held a crew of 2, became packed with mud and root systems. Decades of wash-in turned the wreck into more than metal. Soil packed the wing roots and rear fuselage, adding thousands of pounds to the load. At the same time, corrosion at steel-to-aluminum joints began locking components in place. By the time the recovery team assessed the site, the aircraft was no longer just a wreck. It was a heavy geological feature. The challenge was no longer about finding the aircraft, but about the physics of moving it. The coast was close on the map, unreachable on the ground. The recovery would require lifting the entire mass vertically against gravity. The team had to determine if the airframe could support its own weight, or if the stress of extraction would tear it apart. The recovery operation in late September and early October 1984 began with a restrictive calculation. The Royal Australian Air Force team arrived at the site to find the aircraft intact but significantly heavier than the factory specifications allowed. Before any rigging could be attached, the engineers had to verify the identity of the internal components and the integrity of the main spar. The jungle had hidden the airframe, but it had also filled it. The cockpit offered clues to the site's isolation. Recovery notes described personal items left in the fuselage, suggesting the wreck had not been heavily scavenged in the intervening decades. Even without a perfect inventory, the absence of obvious cut marks and stripped assemblies was the clearest sign that the structure had not been altered by crude salvage. However, the environment had compromised the mechanical fasteners. As the team attempted to access the internal hardpoints, they encountered a phenomenon known as corrosion welding. This occurs when steel bolts are threaded into aluminum structures and exposed to moisture and electrolytes for decades. The two dissimilar metals create a galvanic battery. The resulting chemical reaction generates an oxide layer that expands within the thread interface. This oxide buildup locks the bolt in place with the strength of a weld. This chemical bond presented a significant operational barrier. The team could not simply unscrew the wing panels or the engine mounts to inspect the spar. Every fastener was seized. To assess the structural health of the aircraft, the engineers had to rely on external visual inspection and localized testing of the aluminum skin. The main spar, which runs through the fuselage and supports the wings, appeared sound, but the added weight of the mud created a critical risk. The primary constraint for the extraction was the gross weight relative to the lift asset. To determine if the lift was feasible, the engineers had to calculate the center of gravity relative to the datum line. The datum line is an imaginary vertical plane defined by the manufacturer from which all horizontal distances are measured. It serves as the structural zero point for all weight and balance calculations. In a standard A-20G, the center of gravity is carefully balanced between the heavy nose guns and the tail section. The aircraft sitting in the kunai grass did not match the factory diagrams. The accumulation of 40 years of soil and organic matter inside the rear fuselage and the wing roots shifted the center of gravity aft. It also increased the total mass beyond the safe working limit of the helicopter. The mud acted as a hidden payload. While the aluminum structure was relatively light, the wet soil was dense and immovable. The math was unforgiving. The calculation showed that the airframe in its current condition exceeded the lift envelope of the recovery helicopter. Attempting to lift the aircraft with the engines and outer wings attached would risk stalling the helicopter or snapping the airframe in half due to the uneven load distribution. The team hit a hard boundary. They could not lift the aircraft in one piece. Saving it meant a field disassembly in the jungle, on a machine whose fasteners had, for all practical purposes, welded themselves shut. That October, the extraction of the Douglas A-20G Havoc was governed by a single aerodynamic limit. The recovery asset was a Royal Australian Air Force No. 12 Squadron CH-47 Chinook. While this helicopter is a heavy lift platform, its performance is not absolute. It is constrained by the lift envelope. The lift envelope is the operational boundary defined by air density and gross weight. A helicopter generates lift by pushing air downward with its rotors. In a dense, cold atmosphere, the rotors are highly efficient. In a hot, humid, tropical environment, the air is less dense. This reduces the efficiency of the rotor system and drastically lowers the maximum payload the aircraft can safely carry. The recovery team was operating in the heat of a New Guinea jungle. The calculated weight of the mud-filled bomber exceeded the lift envelope available in those atmospheric conditions. To move the object, the team had to change the math. For weight reduction were the two right RTs. For weight reduction were the two right R2600 engines and the outer wing panels. This disassembly was not a standard maintenance procedure. The corrosion welding that had locked the fasteners meant the components could not be unbolted using the factory manual. The team had to mechanically separate the outer wings from the center section. They removed the engines which acted as heavy anchors on the leading edge. This process shed thousands of pounds of dead weight, including the mud trapped inside the engine cowlings and the wing structures. Once the engines and outer wings were removed, the center fuselage section fell within the safety margin of the Chinook. The rigging crew attached heavy nylon slings to the main spar hardpoints. These points are the strongest part of the airframe designed to carry the load of the aircraft in flight. By lifting from the spar, the team ensured the stress of the lift was transferred through the structural skeleton rather than the fragile aluminum skin. The Chinook hovered over the site, creating a massive downwash that flattened the surrounding kunai grass. The pilots carefully took up the tension on the slings. The center of gravity held true. The fuselage lifted clear of the vegetation that had held it for 4 decades. The helicopter turned toward the coast, carrying the A-20 suspended beneath it. The flight to Madang was short, but it bridged the gap that ground vehicles could not cross. At Madang, the components were lowered onto a hardstand. The recovery operation shifted from an aviation challenge to a maritime logistics operation. The fuselage, engines, and wing panels were loaded onto the HMAS Tarakan, Sukabalik Papan-class landing craft Heavy, for shipment south to Brisbane, Australia. The extraction was successful, but the cost was high. The aircraft was no longer a single unified machine. It was a collection of disjointed parts. The outer wings were severed from the center section. The engines were detached from their mounts. The mud had been washed away, but the protective paint was gone, leaving raw aluminum exposed to the salt air of the ocean crossing. The recovery team had saved the artifact, but they had been forced to dismantle it to do so. The challenge now shifted to the engineers at Amberley, who would have to reverse the entropy of the crash and the violence of the extraction. The arrival of the fuselage at the Royal Australian Air Force Base at Amberley marked the transition from recovery to reconstruction. The objective was to return the aircraft to its 1944 configuration as a static museum exhibit. The decision to pursue a static restoration rather than a flying return to flight was dictated by the material state of the aluminum. The same decades-long galvanic seizure that locked the fasteners also shortened the fatigue life of the primary structure. The aircraft could support its own weight on the ground, but it could no longer withstand the dynamic loads of flight. The restoration team faced an immediate supply chain constraint. The production of Douglas A-20 Havoc components had ceased decades earlier. There was no inventory of new old stock parts to replace the sections that were damaged during the crash or cut during the extraction. The engineers had to rely on a process known as cannibalization. Cannibalization is the engineering practice of harvesting functional components from multiple non-operational units to create a single operational system. In a restoration context, this is necessitated by the complete absence of original equipment manufacturer support. The team cannot order a replacement bulkhead or a wing spar. They must find an existing one that has survived in another wreck and adapt it to the target airframe. This method requires precise validation of part compatibility. While mass production implies interchangeability, World War II aircraft often required hand-fitting on the assembly line. A component from one serial number does not always fit another without modification. To rebuild the Hell'N Pelican II, the team sourced parts from 6 other A-20 airframes recovered from the New Guinea theater. This hybrid restoration strategy required the integration of components that had been manufactured months apart and weathered in different environments. The hardest hunt was the nose. This was a G model with the solid gun nose, structurally unlike the glass-nosed variants, and a matching donor section had to align with the fuselage bulkheads. Finding it meant an exhaustive search across known wreck sites. The restoration process involved drilling out thousands of rivets to separate the damaged skin from the underlying frames. The engineers now had to rebuild what the jungle extraction had torn apart. The outer wings, which had been severed to meet the lift envelope of the Chinook, had to be reattached. This required fabricating new splice plates to bridge the cuts. The team used the datum line to ensure the airframe was aligned correctly before riveting the sections permanently in place. If the fuselage was twisted even a fraction of an inch during reassembly, the wing roots would not mate with the center section. Over 12 years, Royal Australian Air Force restoration teams across several bases cleaned, treated, and reassembled the aircraft, with the final work completed at Amberley. They fabricated brackets that no longer existed and reshaped aluminum skin to replace sections lost to corrosion. By 1996, the aircraft was complete. It was painted in its original olive drab camouflage with the distinctive nose art recreated on the forward fuselage. The 650 caliber guns were installed, returning the aircraft to its visual combat configuration. The result was a single complete airframe built from the remains of 7 different aircraft. It stood on its own landing gear for the first time in 50 years. However, the completion of the restoration highlighted a new discrepancy. The aircraft was physically restored, but it was geographically displaced. It was a Pacific theater artifact sitting in an Australian hangar. The final phase of the recovery was not technical but logistical. The aircraft had to be returned to the country where it was found. The final movement of the Douglas A-20 Havoc, known as the Hell'N Pelican II, occurred in June 2025. This operation was separated from the initial loss by 81 years and from the jungle extraction by 4 decades. The objective was to repatriate the restored airframe from the Royal Australian Air Force Base in Amberley to the National Museum and Art Gallery in Port Moresby, Papua New Guinea. This transfer was not merely a logistical shipment, but the closing of a specific legal and historical loop defined by the chain of custody. Chain of custody is the unbroken trail of documentation that records the sequence of custody, control, transfer, and disposition of physical evidence. In a forensic or museum context, it is the mechanism that validates the provenance of an object. It proves that the aluminum structure sitting on the museum floor is the same specific serial number that was signed for by the pilot in 1944, and the same wreckage surveyed by the recovery team in 1984. Without a verified chain of custody, an artifact loses its historical authority and becomes a generic display piece. For the Hell'N Pelican II, this chain included the original loss report, the 1976 survey logs, the 1984 recovery manifest, and the restoration records from Amberley. Moving the aircraft required a reversal of the assembly process. While the airframe was now clean and painted, it was also more fragile than the mud-filled wreck that had been lifted from the jungle. The restoration had returned the aircraft to a static condition, meaning it lacked the structural continuity of a factory-fresh machine. The wings and tail section had to be removed to fit the fuselage within the shipping dimensions of the transport vessel. Unlike the field disassembly in the jungle, which required cutting through corrosion, this disassembly was executed with precision tools to preserve the finished surfaces. The fuselage was loaded onto a heavy transport truck for the journey to the port of Townsville. From there, it was transferred to the deck of the ADV Reliant, an offshore support vessel operated for the Australian Department of Defence. Its open deck and cargo handling capability made it well-suited to carrying oversized items like a dismantled airframe. The sea voyage north retraced the general strategic route of the Allied advance in 1944, moving from the rear supply bases in Australia back toward the operational zones of New Guinea. Upon arrival in Port Moresby, the aircraft faced one final transport constraint. The route from the port to the museum required navigating modern urban infrastructure. The wide load of the fuselage section had to be managed through traffic and narrow intersections. The team used a low-loader trailer to minimize the vertical clearance required for the tail structure. The aircraft was offloaded at the National Museum and Art Gallery and reassembled for the final time. It was placed on static display as the centerpiece of the aviation collection. This placement fulfills the primary objective of the recovery, which was to preserve the specific history of the 5th Air Force in the theater where it operated. Hell'N Pelican II is now one of the few restored A-20G Havocs, and the only one on public display in Papua New Guinea, the country where it was found. The presence of the physical aircraft allows for a direct verification of the events of Black Sunday. The bent propellers and the repaired skin tell the story of the fuel criticality and the forced landing without the need for dramatization. The aircraft exists as a tangible record of the decision made by Second Lieutenant Davidson. It validates the technical competence of the crew who survived the landing and the engineering discipline of the teams that extracted and restored the machine. The recovery process converted a decaying wreck in the kunai grass into a permanent historical asset, securing the evidence of the past against the erosion of the environment.